Hello all, thanks for joining. It's been a few weeks since I published a video. I wanted to spend just a few minutes and show you where I'm at on the restoration of this beautiful Chanticleer 2D570. So I'm starting off the restoration of the chassis so I can do some derusting by removing the variable tuning condenser and the associated tuning dial. Here are a couple set screws on the shaft of the tuning condenser that were removed, as well as a couple screws here on the front that hold the tuning dial plate and associated hardware back to the radio. Very simple removal. Just took a few minutes here to be able to get the associated hardware removed and set aside for some further detail and cleanup. As you can see from the photos that I'm sharing, removal of the variable tuning condenser was straightforward. There were 4 standoffs, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. I just removed the 4 screws, and then again the electrical connections to the variable tuning condenser from underneath the chassis components back to the tuning condenser itself. I just clipped those wires and then removed the tuning condenser from the chassis. Here are a few more photos of the variable tuning condenser after being removed from the chassis itself and the associated hardware. This was very important because I wanted to spend some time doing some derusting to see how successful I would be using navel jelly on the top of the chassis. I then moved on to the variable tuning condenser by soaking the variable tuning condenser in evaporust for about 3 days, followed by some spot removal of rust using navel jelly. As you can see, I was successful in removing the rust, and the variable tuning condenser really cleaned up nicely. I've checked it electrically and it performs well. Again, I'll throw a little bit of grease and oil in the bearings, but overall it turned out well, and I'm glad to have this piece of the restoration behind me. Having the tuning condenser out of the way provides a better view of the rust removal that lies ahead on the chassis. The next step was to start removing some of the other components as well. The choke that's on the back side of the chassis was up next. For those of you that watched my first video, I mentioned the choke was open. After doing some additional testing, it was actually a cold solder joint, so I feel very fortunate. So I completed the derusting on the choke and then painted it, and it's ready to be reinstalled on the chassis and wired in at a later date. Up next was the removal of the coils that you see here on the chassis, and a few still photos here of those devices. I also took the opportunity to go ahead and take resistance readings and document both of the coils for future reference. I then proceeded to remove the electrolytic can capacitor. If you watch the first video, again, it's just there for aesthetic purposes. I do plan on restuffing this capacitor and remove the 3 electrolytic capacitors underneath. Next up was the removal of the speaker, the audio transformer, and fill coil. I then spent numerous hours working on the speaker itself and the associated hardware. There was a lot of rust, and there's a lot of pitting that you can't really see well here in the photos that I'm sharing. I did make a decision to go ahead and move forward and paint the speaker and the associated components. A few photos here of the speaker after painting. Again, I'll kind of clean this up a little bit with some light sanding. Overall, though, it turned out well. After a closer look at the speaker itself, it's completely blown out, so I will recone that, and I'll share some of those photos in a future video. With these major components now removed from the chassis, it frees up a nice work area to get in here and start the derusting process. So stay tuned for that. That'll be the next video, and I'll make a decision if I end up painting the chassis or just stick with the derusting. Thanks again for all my new subscribers out there, and for everyone taking time to watch the video in this series on this restoration of this beautiful Chanticleer 2D570 from the early to mid 1930s.